I have a long name. My name is Dr. Patricia Timerman Barbosa da Silva. My students asked me to just call me Dr. T. So for a while, it's just been easier to go by Dr. T. I am a mental health counselor and a marriage and family therapist in the state of Florida, and I reside in Miami, Florida. So people can find me. The name of my company is Advocate to Create, and the two is the number two. I truly believe in advocacy. So I really wanted to make sure that, I think through mental health, we're able to help our clients learn to advocate for themselves, which I think is awesome. So Advocate to Create. I also have an Advocate to Create teachable.com, which is a place where I have different workshops or trainings for mental health, being either for therapists and clinicians or just the community at large.
So if I pronounce your name, your full name correctly, I'm going to cheat a little bit here. So it's Dr. Patricia Tipperman Barboso da Silva.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And what's my prize for pronouncing it
Oh my
correctly?
God. Like that's what make what I say, like ding ding dings. Like it's not this. You got yeah, no, I used to be just Patricia Timmerman for 33 years of my life. And then Barbosa da Silva came later. And it people just mess up that name. It is so funny. Like you get so many different variations of the name. And my name is not even as long as my husband's. So I
So he has the longer name.
oh yes. Oh yes. And he's proud of it. And I'm like, I was mine was so easy. It was just two names. Um, but even for community, so here we are gonna talk a little bit about like communication and just names and knowing like when you see Patricia Timmerman, you're like, okay, where is she from? It's not that like difficult to say. When you say Barbosa da Silva, it's like, okay, she's Brazilian, right? Like names can tell so much about a person, about their culture, about their nationality, their race. Like names can be very unique, and it communicates so much.
I agree. I agree. Like when people hear my name, Turin, because I'm in Toronto, Canada, and my background, like I was born in the French part of Canada.
Okay.
So when people hear the name Terrain, they're like, oh, Terrain. Like, oh, you're French. So like it gives it right away. So you're absolutely right. And I wonder why that is because my parents are Jamaican, but it's like they decided when they came over to Canada, and then their firstborn, which is me, when they picked a name, it just so happened to be a French name, even though their background has nothing to do with
That's
French.
interesting. Yeah. And right, in Brazil, it is very usual for people to have middle names. But my brother, my sister, and I, we don't. It's just Patricia Timmerman. And then my little brother from my dad, my parents got divorced when I was really young. So my dad had my little brother with my stepmom, and he also is just first last name. And I noticed that in my family, maybe because we have an European background, um, I don't know if in Europe it's used to having two names or not, but I know in Brazil, most people usually ask me, like, so what's your middle name? I'm like, I don't have one. Um, to them was weird, but to me, it was just how I grew up. So it wasn't.
Do you have like a nickname, like a name that people would call you?
God, I have so many depending on who's talking to me. Um, my really like one of my best friends calls me P time because one we were actually as I was doing the book and editing the book, the person had like Patricia Timmerman, so P time was my the name there. So she saw that and she couldn't help herself. My dad calls me Pachuca or Pachulachu, again very Brazilian. My siblings call me Kihale, Ki for short, and that is Yiddish because there was a song that I used to hate growing up that my grandma used to sing that says Pachi Kihale. And so they used to call me this. I have many different names. How about you?
I do. So because I asked that question because I've noticed a lot of people who don't have middle names, they usually have like a secondary name that like people just adopt, right? And you've had like 500 of them. So for me, my nickname is, and this has been like very, very young, has always been like chameleon, right? And the reason for that is, well, I think, anyways, anytime I went to school or if I went to an event, it was always outside of where I lived, which is kind of like lower middle class or poor neighborhood, but I was
Okay.
always able to fit in. So I would go to the better schools, I go to the better events, right? Even though when I came back home, it was like the ghetto or the poor, right? So like, oh, you fit in like a chameleon, and then it just
Yeah, I
stuck
love that.
all
I think
these
my
years.
husband is like that. Like he's like
Mm.
he'll get along with anybody, no matter who it is. I love that.
Yeah, I think it's such a beautiful like trait. Is that what's called? Yeah, trait to have.
Yeah. No, oh my God, 100%. Um, but we're talking about like names and then communication, what it tells about you. And I was wondering because you said, your parents are Jamaican and moved to Canada. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, yes.
Okay.
The French side of Canada, of all places.
The French side of okay. So how do you identify? Like, do you identify by the culture that your parents had at home, or were they more like Canadian culture? How do you identify?
Well, I because I was raised by my grandmother, I didn't know my parents until I was about 5 years old.
Okay.
So when I was born, it was in the French side. So my grandmother was there. So I was raised around it. So that's what I knew. Like obviously, like when I looked at my grandmother, I was like, okay, no, she's not from this area, right? So growing up and like being around the people there, I didn't realize how much I adopted that side until I started to go to school. And then
Okay.
when people started hearing me speak, they're like, oh, you have like that accent, like in the way I pronounce my words. But to me, it was just normal, right? Because everyone in my house had the same accent, right? Because they were there so long themselves. So when I met my parents, and then I was like, oh, okay, there's this whole Jamaican side, and the way they speak is totally different, right?
Really? Okay.
So that's where I had like, okay, this is my background, but I only know of this. So that's how I identified, right? Because growing up, everyone told me you have this accent, you have this, you have that. So I just said, okay. So I kind of didn't like it as a kid, but now as an adult, I love it because it kind of makes me unique.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. I don't know. Okay, I have a rule in therapy, which is whenever something comes to my mind, comes out through my mouth. So I'm gonna apply this rule here because something came to my mind, so it's gonna come out through my mouth. But when you said, like something that I had, like the people would tell me that I have an accent that I hated, but now it's something that like I love and I find it unique. So I don't look Brazilian, right? Like when you think Brazilian, you don't think this, I would assume. Um, and to me, I remember I hated my freckles. I hated it with a passion and how white I am. Like I've always stood out. I am super white. Like my skin, like again, in Brazil growing up, um, if I was always, I would stand out no matter where I was. And I really disliked it for a long time. I used to be called like Casper or like growing up, people tease you about your differences. I think that if I was growing up today, things are a lot more difficult as opposed to back then where there were no phones. There was like, it didn't follow you. Um, but I today it's something that I've learned to love about myself is my skin color and my freckles because it's something that I really grew up um, having a really difficult relationship with.
Same. Absolutely the same because it made me back then I probably thought it made me stand out in all the wrong ways, but now it's kind of like unique in a lot of ways, right? Like when I like if I were to pull up like a stereotypical picture of a Brazilian or a Jamaican, we probably didn't look like that when we were growing up. I didn't have the dreads, which I have now. I didn't have the beard, which I had now. And as you mentioned, you had freckles. Like, I don't think if you're to ask 100 people saying that, oh, do you know Brazilians have freckles? They'll be like, oh, really? Well, online, I see them shaped this way. I see them very tanned. And when they think of like someone with a Jamaican culture, like if I had to tell you I had curly hair when I was growing up, they're like, really? Usually when I see Jamaicans, they have like the full beard, they have the dreads, they have the Jamaican hat. So it's interesting to see how much stereotypes plays in our childhood and impacts us.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things that I love about kind of going a little bit into the the model that I developed, and I call it intention, action, perception, which is what this book is about. But part of it is so let me do a mini TED talk on this. I'm just kidding. Intention is internal to us. Only we know our intentions, right? That's part of the premise of it. Perception is also internal to us, or to the person who's observing or receiving the action. The only external thing is the action itself. But you were talking to me about the lens through which you grew up, even not knowing that people sounded different until you went somewhere else. Because to you, like, what do you mean I have an accent? Everybody sounds like me in my household. So our perception is shaped by our worldview, by how we grew up, by the way that we interact with the world and the world interacts with us. And each of us have had a different experience of the world based on our skin color, our ethnicity, our religion, our sexual orientation, gender identity, right? Everything. So all of those impact our perceptions. And one of the things that I noticed that kind of brought up this model is how we believe that the way that we perceive the world is obviously the way that everybody else perceives the world. And it's not until we start understanding these differences that we're like, oh, okay, that's why my actions got lost in translation. Like, wow, dude. Right? But up to that point, you think that, the expression actions speak louder than words. The frustration that I have is that the implication of that statement is that all actions are universal or have a universal meaning, and they don't. It really depends on our background and our perception of the world.
Why do you think we struggle with that as children, but then maybe we struggle to understand that as adults?
Because to us, I think growing up, like, that this is the way, right? So I can't fathom that there's a different way of seeing things that everybody around me does. If everybody in my family does things this way, then of course everybody in the world experiences things in the same way. So I think it's just ingrained in our mind that our way of thinking is the way of thinking. And it's not until we open our minds up to identify that there are other ways of seeing the same thing that then we welcome it more. Does that make sense?
It does, because it reminds me of a situation where I didn't know I was poor until someone told me I was poor.
Okay.
Right? Because I didn't go without when I was growing up as a child, right? Like my grandmother did the best that she could. And to me, if someone didn't tell me this wasn't my mother, why would I believe this not my mother? Because she's always there, right?
Yeah.
So when someone told me, they're like, "Hey, where's your mom and dad?" and they pointed to their mom and dad, that's where I saw an age difference. I was like, "Oh, okay, the person that's my mother is looks like she's older, but you still don't understand because you're a child, but you can observe it." And then when I would go back to the apartment, and then looking back, I was like, "Yeah, okay, I didn't have this, I didn't have that." But that's me looking back. When I was going through it, it wasn't like I was sitting there saying that, why don't I have a car? Why don't I have this type of dinner? Why don't I have that? I was still being taken care of. So I think you're absolutely right. Like you don't know what you don't have until someone points out what you don't have.
Yeah. Yeah. No, 100%. Or even what you have.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like if you have like I'll use like you and your husband, like if you have like a marriage, right? Or if it's like a good marriage, or if it's something else, someone's like, yeah, you know what? Your husband, your wife, they're pretty good people. Where you're looking at it as maybe because sometimes you're in it for so long, you're like, yeah, this is my person. But they're highlighting things that if you could, because I remember someone was pointing out something that when I was that my girlfriend does, and I sat back, I was like, yeah, I remember when that was like new to me, and when that was like it meant so much more, but now it's like a part of a relationship where maybe someone else who's going without it, they're like, I wish I can talk to my partner about this, and I wish I can talk to my partner about that. And I'm surprised how many people don't have communications with the person they're in a relationship with.
Yeah. Again, that's the reason that I did this. Right? Is it's really, so I tell my husband, I've been with my husband for 12 years now. And I've had long-term relationships in the past, and I've had, good and bad. But one of the things that I've noticed is that the negative aspects of past relationships have allowed me to understand who is the partner I did not want to be. Right. And it became less about who is the partner that I want to have and more about who do I want to be in the relationship. And one of the things that's happened in past relationships was me walking on eggshells. And I'm like, I don't want to walk on eggshells again. Right. I want to be able to talk, to communicate. And I had a supervisor, right, during my, after your master's, you do like 2 years of supervision. I absolutely love her, Dr. Sylvia Reyes. And she would always tell me that she loved when things went wrong because that's when you really learn. That's when like it is engraved in your mind. And I'm like, it's true because like the negative aspects of past relationships have really stood out and I've learned from it, right? What I don't want in a relationship. And it was from my marriage that I started realizing that his way of thinking was different from my way of thinking. And it's not that he was wrong and I was right, or he was right and I was wrong. It's just that the two of us looked at it in such distinct ways that we couldn't understand each other. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. So tell me more. So when that was going on in your relationship, what was the impact to maybe the both of you individually and as a couple?
So I can give an example, right? Like I think one of the first ones that kind of started the concept of the IAP, of the intention action perception. There was this fight that we had, and I remember distinctly that day in the apartment. We had moved in together. We were living together just for a little bit, and we had a fight. And after that fight, I left the room. Now my thinking was, I'm leaving the room. You asked better follow me to show me that you care. He didn't follow me. Ergo, he did not care, right? That was my thought. You did not follow me. You don't care. And then he heard me like getting really infuriated outside, like outside the room. He went outside, we got a little madder, and then we kind of cooled down. And then I asked him, like, why did you not follow? And he said, you created space. And if I had created space, I would have wanted you to respect that. So in respecting you, I didn't follow you. And I was like, oh, okay, that's not how I saw it at all. So then one of the things that we learned from that event is if he leaves, I stay. If I leave, he follows. But there were little things like that that allowed me to see how he sees things differently and allow him to see how I see things differently. And then we are better able to work accordingly, if that makes any sense. Or even if I'm able to say, hey, I really disliked when I saw this happening. Can you let me know what your intention was? Because this is how I saw it. And being able to kind of talk like that with each other is I'm letting you, instead of being reactive to what I see, which sometimes I am, I'm human and we all are, but the majority of the times we kind of pause ourselves and I'm like, hey, what was your intention behind this? Because the way that I received it was really negative and I didn't like it. Right. So the other person is able to clear things up or say, no, that was my intention because I was mad at you. Does that make sense?
It does. It does because it reminds me of a situation where I had where the communication unfortunately wasn't as refined as what
Okay.
you described, right? So this person unfortunately, and if you're watching, I apologize because I know that you do, because she's an ex. She leads with sex. So when she's trying to resolve something, she resolves it through sex.
Okay.
That's her thing. Me, on the other hand, I don't resolve situations like that. I'm a communicator. It could be because of my training, my experience, things like that. So when you're trying to when you when you're trying to emotionally connect with someone that can only sexually connect with you, it's going to butt heads. So when and no one likes being rejected. So when someone's offering their body to you to kind of resolve the situation, you're like, hold up, not right now because I'm not in the mood. How about we have this conversation? Now you have a whole different type of fight, right? Because now
Uh,
you're rejecting the person that is causing you to be upset. So what I did is I had to communicate to her saying that it's not you in regards to what you're offering. It's at this point in time is not the most appropriate way to try to resolve that. Unfortunately for this person, she would shut down because that's all that she knew and that was her baseline. So it was tough. And I remember a direct quote she told me. This was like after we broke up. She was like, Terrain, men don't reject women. Women reject men.
okay.
That's exactly what I said. And you know, when someone is upset at you, when you say the words okay, what happens? They get more mad. But the relationship was over at this point, right? Like she was offering something else, which was that. But it's tough. I sometimes I feel bad because it's tough for people who resolve the issue one way and they're not able to see the other side. So what would you like tell those who struggle to say that there's more than who struggle to understand there's more than one way to resolve an issue, and if you're unable to at least see the other person's perspective, there may be future problems as well.
That's fair, and I appreciate that question, right? Because we have defense mechanisms. Again, going back to the concept of our perception and the meaning that we associate to things, and uh, sex, for example, right? And learning that that is a way to pause a fight or, something to be used in that way. So it becomes like a defense mechanism that we use to certain triggers. One of the coping skills that I've developed, so in this book, which I call it "Why Are We Fighting?" Right? The first two chapters are on the theory, but chapter three is all about coping skills, and they're both strategies for the person communicating and for the person receiving the communication. So the one I'm going to talk about is for the person receiving the communication. In this case, I call it the rule of three interpretations. In this rule, I ask the person who's receiving the information to identify what is a fact, what is something that is known, and what are assumptions or embellishments, right? So an example that I can give, different from this, just to make it simple. My boyfriend didn't call me when he said he was going to call me. Then I can think right away, worst case scenario. My boyfriend didn't call me. That means he's going to break up with me. And if I don't check myself, then he's going to break up with me. Sounds like a fact inside my mind. And now I start reacting, right? And I will call like a million times until he picks up. And when he finally picks up, I'm mad by the time, right? He has no idea what's going on. The only known is he didn't call me when he said he was going to call. So what I ask us to do is, once you identify the fact, the trigger, I want you to pause. You have your first assumption. He's not going to, the automatic thought, he was going to break up with me. Pause and identify two other possibilities. One is, if you're going to go to worst case scenario, what's a best case scenario? Best case scenario is he is planning a surprise party for me and can't pick up the phone. And a likely case scenario, his battery died. Right? Once you have all three, now I want you to choose which one serves you best. I don't care the one that serves you best. If you want to break up with a person and you think the first one is going to break up with me and I just want to be done, then that's the one for you. But if you don't want to break up with a person, you think about, like, no, I want to, whatever serves you best at that moment, then you get to choose, because those are all assumptions, right? And this causes us to have to, one, pause, two, differentiate between facts and assumptions, and three, be able to respond as opposed to react, right? I have to think of two alternative case scenarios. So sometimes I need to think of something completely outside of my immediate thinking. How does that person think when they do stuff? Does that make sense? I use
It
this
does.
a lot, by the way, because I want to make sure that what I say and what people hear is the same thing. So I'll often ask, does that make sense?
No, I actually I used to do that when I felt that maybe something I was saying wasn't coming across the way I intended it. too. So I wonder how much of that is like us,
I know, right? It's
right?
part of health. What can I say?
I
Uh,
know. For me, I think I'm gonna. There's a point in time where that would have benefited me because there's times where if something was happening, or let's say there was a situation I need clarity on, and the person was unresponsive, I would think of a scenario in my mind. But it could have simply been that they're at work or they're busy. And I wonder how much of that is because we're so used to texting now instead of calling. Because if
it's
I were to, it's instant, right? So you could be texting back and forth for 20, 30 minutes, and then all of a sudden there's a 2 hour gap, right? So like one of my friends, she's dating, she's single, she's dating, and that's like her pet peeve now because she in her mind she's thinking that the person is somewhere else doing something else or doing someone else, right? Because for her it always seems to happen when she's asking a question that she really wants the answer to, and then there's a gap. And I asked her, I'm like, I wonder how much is of that is your perception of time. She's like, what do you mean? It's like watching like a kettle boil. Like if you were to watch it, it seems like forever. But if you put it on and you go, it seems like, oh my God, that was so quick. What are your thoughts?
oh my God. So I struggle with some anxiety. And what I notice, especially as it relates to time, my urgency distorts time. And I became very aware of that once when I came to the house and I came from a gym. I actually went outside. I have a gym in my condominium, but I met a friend somewhere else. I was gonna come back home and I had a client at 3, but I was gonna have enough time. But I caught so much traffic that I got home at like 2:40. Now I have a thing about punctuality. I'm gonna have to give you context of this context. My parents are divorced, and growing up we would the three of us, because we have, so again, 3 kids from my parents marriage and my little brother that came 12 years later. So we would be downstairs waiting for my dad, but my dad worked several jobs and traffic, I mean, if you well, you're in Canada, I don't know how traffic is in Canada. People who live in Miami, we think traffic is bad. Dude, you have not been to Sao Paulo. Like Sao Paulo traffic is horrible, like horrible. But we're kids, so we don't know all of that. But we would be waiting downstairs for my dad to arrive. Now, my parents divorced and it wasn't a friendly divorce. So we couldn't really go upstairs because we didn't want my mom to know that my dad hadn't arrived. And so, we would stay downstairs. So I have a thing with punctuality, right? I have a really big thing with punctuality. So now fast forward to this day. I 2:40. I have my client at 3. Mind you, this is a virtual therapy. All my setup is there. All I need to do is just connect. I already know the case for the client because I go through it in the morning. Beautiful. Okay. I eat something really quick. It's 2:50. I have 10 minutes. I'm walking to my Nespresso machine to make me coffee. And all I can think of is, please don't ask me to make your coffee. Please don't ask me to make your coffee, for my husband. My husband usually asks for espresso, which takes, say, 10 seconds. Mine is a lungo. Let's say it takes 25. A total of what, 35 seconds? Let's give it a full minute. My urgency made it feel as if that 1 minute was longer than the 10 minutes that I had. And that was the moment that I realized, oh my God, like my urgency distorts time. And my husband turns to me, is like, you never realized this before? I was like, wait, you saw it from outside, okay? You don't live in my brain. But yes, and I love that you said that to your friend because it is very true, right? Sometimes we need to check how urgent is my urgency, because our urgency does distort time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's exactly what's happening to her because she needs that answer, right? And when you look at the time, it's like it's been a minute, it's been 5 minutes, it's been 10 minutes. Well, I asked this question. I'm like, understand, but life goes on. Even people who are jobless, sometimes they're the hardest people to get a hold of, right? So, what are maybe some tips that, like, if you were to speak to her, what are some tips that you can share with her to maybe reduce the anxiety that she would feel?
So it's funny. So let's say if she were here, there are a couple things that I would want to know. One is how come the automatic thought is that he may be doing someone else, right? Where does that come from? Is there a history of it? Has this person shown any reason to, right, to trigger those emotions? Because if the example I can give, like if I've never been cheated on before and my husband takes a call in a different room, I may not notice it at all or notice and not care. But if I've been cheated in the past, and let's say my husband is not the person who cheated on me, but I've been cheated on in the past and my husband takes a room in the other call, immediately I'm going to be like, huh? This is suspicious behavior. Now you need to prove to me that you're not doing what I think you're doing, right? So I would want to know, like, does this person, has he or she ever given you reason for pause, right? Or is this a trigger from preceding experiences? Like, do they deserve the benefit of the doubt? And two, I'd say there's something that I call a preamble in this book, and the preamble serves two functions. The first one is to tell you the intention of or what I need from you from our interaction. So let's say if I tell you, hey, I just need to vent, I do not want any feedback at this moment, I am not open to solutions. Are you open to just like me talking to you and venting? This way you're not thinking about what do you want from me as we're talking. And usually people believe that we want their solutions. And then we get frustrated with their solutions and fight with them about their solutions, defending our problem because we're not open to it. Right. So the preamble is one function is that, and the other one is to soften the blow. If I have something difficult to say, I'll tell you what the intention behind it is. So maybe be able to express, hey, whenever we go for long pauses, I get a little bit triggered because of past experiences. So I'll let you know when I have something really important that I want to know. If we could not pause at that moment, I would really appreciate it. Right. And letting the other person know what is triggering you, because I cannot know what I don't know. And when I don't know, I'm just gonna interpret things my way. So whomever she's texting with may just think, oh, I'll put the phone here, let me go play video games or do whatever. But if I see a message saying, hey, it's really important before you go away, because I know we do this pauses, could you answer this question for me? Then I will be waiting for the question because now I know this is important to you before I go away. Does that make sense?
It does, because now you've given me an interesting perspective. Because when you're saying that, I thought about a time where I told someone that I need to talk to them about something, right? To me, I was just saying it because I actually needed to talk to them about something. And then we had the conversation. You know what they told me afterwards? They thought that because I was dating the person, they thought I was going to tell them that I was married and I had children. I was like, no. I'm like, why would you think that? And why would I be so calm to share that, right? Because now they've piqued my curiosity, right? Because it was like when we talked about earlier how when someone says something, now you begin to see differently. So now when I got that context, I started to replay the conversation. And then I saw her facial expressions because she was kind of looking at me like this with her head tilted up, like she was expecting the bad news. I don't know if that's like her bad news face. Like that's the side that gets it. So it's interesting that, like, and you raise a good point. So it's interesting how you can say something with the best of intentions, but the other person, because of their past experiences, it brings them exactly back to that moment, even though it has nothing to do with you. So is that maybe a lack of communication?
I think it's even, yes, it's a lack of communication, but I think it's even beyond that. Is sometimes we don't know how much is okay for us to share with other people. Um, and so we don't. Uh, right. And since we don't share, I love saying I cannot know what I don't know. But there's more to it. I cannot know when I don't know. And when I don't know, I act based on what I think I know. Right. So let's say if you grew up in a household where there was a lot of banter, right? And people are, that some people do some mean bantering, but that's just like they're playing with each other. I didn't grow up in a house with banter. And I remember my first roommate at NYU would do some bantering. Like she would sometimes, like, to me, it just felt like you're talking down, like, do you not like me? And she's like, no. When I criticize you is because I love you. I'm like, that is a weird way of showing love. Right. So if I grew up in a household where there was emotional or verbal abuse, your banter will come out abusive to me, right? But we don't usually open up about these things, so the other person has no way of knowing. I think that when we find a comfort in being able to share with each other a little bit more, we gain more context as to the other person. Like this, the intention, action, perception in this book requires us to understand not just ourselves, but how well do we know being our partner, because this is uh, independent of the type of relationship, right? But how well do I know this other person and how they think? And if I don't know them well enough, then maybe it would be beneficial for me to ask more questions so I can then communicate better.
Well, you mentioned the book and the three actionable items. So how can the person on the receiving end who are saying these things, but they're like, oh, that I didn't mean to tell you, I didn't mean that. Like, I'm not married, I don't have a wife, I don't have all these kids, right? How can, like, let's say someone like me in that situation, who all I mean is that, hey, I have something to share and it's actually positive news, but because those words or that line of reasoning is taking that person somewhere else, how can I try to maybe assist in resolving some of that issue?
Okay. So I mean, one is the that preamble, right? In letting you know the intention behind what I want to say before telling you what I'm going to say. Right. So if my intention is, because I want to make sure to foster the honesty and the trust we have in the relationship, I wanted to share something that I disliked, as I would like for you to do with me. So now I know the intention, as opposed to me just going ahead and saying, hey, I really didn't like your cooking. I don't know. Right. The other one of the, and I think it's the first one that I talk about here, coping skills, is what I have a theme with threes. Okay. For some reason, there's like something with threes, but I call it the three columns of communication, right? Column one is venting. Say what you need to say, but it's not venting to the person, for the love of God. You can write a text if you want. You can like vent it out loud in the shower, however you want to do it, but not to the person. Because when we vent, if I'm just telling you my frustrations, I will go on tangents, right? And I will then use examples that have nothing to do with anything. And if I'm doing directly to the person that I want to vent to, then because I don't know the words that I want to choose, it will likely get lost in translation. And then we're going to start arguing about something that has nothing to do with the fight itself. Right. So the first part is venting. And one of the things that I like to say is when life gives you stresses, use one of your five senses, meaning use our senses to fact check ourselves. Right. So if I say my thoughts out loud, I can hear them. I'll often tell my clients to vent in the shower, because then you're feeling the water soothing you as you say it out loud. And then the shower can serve as a little bit of a noise muffler for anyone who's outside, writing or, like messaging or whatever, but not to send it, for please. You have the sense of vision, you can read it, the sense of hearing, if you want to videotape or audio, yourself, because you're using your senses to fact check yourself and identify what is really the message I want the person to receive, which is column two. Column two is deciphering the message that I want the person to receive. And in the worksheet that I've developed, I actually ask a few questions, including, why do I want the person to receive this message, and to what end? What is the purpose behind it, and what am I expecting in return? So I've done column one, venting; column two, deciphering the message; column three, which becomes the most important one, is what's the best delivery method? Based on how well I know that person, what is the best way for that individual to receive the message I am trying to convey? Right? If I'm going to convey it in my way, it may not come across. When I was doing my dissertation, which was on suicide grief, and I would talk with my husband, I would use sports analogies, specifically jiu-jitsu analogies, because I knew that analogies of things that he likes would work with him in understanding the concept of what I was trying to do. Right. So we try to identify the best delivery method. If we don't have one, then we use the I statement. And then I go through the I statement formula and the do's and don'ts to successfully do the I statement formula. Because people tend to, I'll just give this one. That's the best way of cheating the I statement. I feel like you don't do enough. It's I feel and the emotion. The words like or that, it's cheating. Okay, I'm gonna shut up now because I talk too much.
No, no, keep talking, please. I'm learning. I'm learning because the venting I've come across because I've had a few friends who do a lot of venting. Well, one of them actually we're not friends anymore because of the venting.
Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately what he did was he was very controlling in it. So I'll give you an example. So he would say that if I call you 10 times a day, you would have to answer.
Okay.
Yeah, so there could be times where you're at work, right? I remember one time for someone, like let's say you work 8 hours, he called every hour,
Wow. Okay.
right? So it became a bit much. But one out of the three that I really like was deciphering the message because sometimes when I'm told something, I take it my way, right? With my experiences, with my childhood, whatever. And then sometimes I have to take a step back and say, okay, how is Patricia wanting this message to be delivered,
Yeah.
right? But how do we get to that point? Because I think, and you said like a cheat code, you and I are experienced and trained, but John or Jane down the street may not be able to understand the message in the way that it wants to be deciphered. And then the delivery also plays a part in that as well.
I think that the delivery is huge. And the reason, what I like about the three columns of communication is really requires you to identify, do I actually know how that person would receive my information? Because again, we are under the impression that everybody communicates the way that we communicate. Actions speak louder than words. Therefore, all actions are universal and say the same thing. And they are not. So it really brings to the awareness that maybe I don't know how that person actually receives it. And it becomes a conversation on how do you best receive information? Right. And when I'm talking to my clients in session, I will ask them, like, how, even when I'm teaching, I will ask my students, how do you learn best? I am not an auditory learner at all. I am kinesthetic and visual. If I am just like, if we're engaging, having conversation, absolutely. But in session, I'm often writing because that's how I process information. If I'm just staring at you, dude, right? My best friend is an auditory learner. You say something to her once and it just sticks. I don't know how she does that. I even said, like, it must be the most annoying thing to be friends with me. Right. But we've had to have a communication of how do we talk to each other? Because I'm a very direct person. I'm very straight to the point. And sometimes my directness can be received as rudeness. I noticed that with my in-laws. So my father-in-law is the son of a diplomat. So his way of communicating is a little less straight to the point. Right. And he perceives himself as a direct person, but his directedness is very different from mine. Mine is drier in a way, right? Because I want, this is what I want to communicate with you. Did you like my food? Well, it's not particularly my taste, right? I didn't really like it because I don't want to lie to you. So I'll tell you. Whereas you would likely say, oh, I mean, it tastes delicious, or like, oh, I love that you love making this. Right. So we've had to learn how to communicate with each other. And I remember telling him once, when I noticed, I didn't know that he took offense to something that I said. And so it was surprising to me when he told me. And so one of the things that I said is, I'm going to work on my approach in being softer when I'm talking. And at the same time, I'll ask you to receive what I tell you with a softer lens. And today so happy, and I love my father-in-law. I'm so proud of him because he's even incorporated the IEP so much. And today he tells me that when I am direct with him, he sees it as me being so comfortable that I don't need to go around with my words. Whereas before, it was maybe seen as an affront. So when we learn each other, we become better able to understand each other's way of communicating. Does that make sense?
It does, because that would lead into my next question. Does that mean, or have you experienced then, maybe your training has made you perceive things differently than you would have if you didn't have that training?
Oh, the person that I was before my master's in mental health and the person that I became after are two very different people. I say 2009 was the worst year of my life. To this day and forever, it will continue to always be the worst year of my life. It was like that, the yo-yo relationship that you go back and you break up and you go back and you break up. And if I stopped, I would think, and thinking hurt, so I wouldn't stop. My mom used to say I had wheels on my feet. Uh, it would be like work going out, work going like, but I could not stop to think. And then I started my master's in mental health. And I remember calling my friend one day and saying I had watched the first Sex and the City movie, and one of the actors or one of the characters said like, "I'm happy like every day, not all day every day, but every day." And I remember telling my friend, "I'm unhappy every day." Right? Like it was a difficult year for me. And going into mental health, one of the things about the master's and then the PhD in it is it requires you to do a lot of self-searching, understanding your biases, understanding why you think the way that you think. And then you go into different theories, cognitive behavioral therapy, psychoanalysis, right? And you start analyzing yourself a little bit. And what I love about being narrative therapy or CBT, even what led to the IAP, the intention, action, perception, is understanding how I think about things and why is it that this is the way that I think about things, and is there a better way to think about things that fosters the person that I want to be or the relationship that I want to have. Again, I'm still at fault at many times to like falling back into default thinking, and getting agitated and animated and frustrated. I mean, my family can tell you that like politics for me, like especially because in my family we had very opposing political views and ideology, it's become a point where it gives me so much anxiety that I say we can't talk politics. Like I can't, because I am so impassioned about it. I mean, I was a political science major at NYU, so like I get very passionate. Um, so it triggers me and I need to pause and even apologize for my reaction, yet still saying, please, let's not talk politics so it doesn't trigger the reaction. Uh, right, but yeah, no, I'm a completely different person because it allowed me to think about how I think.
I spoke to someone who's a therapist. I've known them a while, and I interviewed her, and her and I were just like off camera, we're just talking about some of like the relationship dynamics. And that's how we're talking. We're like, okay, this relationship dynamic, some people are like emotional trauma, they're emotionally distanced. We're throwing around all these words, right? And for some reason, I just stopped. I took a moment because she was talking about her personal relation, her current relationship. And I asked her, when you're having conversations with your partner, do you use these words? She's like, what do you mean? I was like, well, think about it from the other perspective, right? Like, who goes to the partner? Well, you know what? Today you're feeling a little bit emotionally distant from me. Is it because of your trauma from your childhood? Like, everyday people don't use that, right? And she's like, oh my God, you're absolutely right. So when I ended that conversation with her, I spoke to my girlfriend on the phone. And because I was still in that mode, she's like, oh, you sound like really educated and professional. This is what she said to me, right? But I took it as her saying I was trying to coach and mentor her.
Okay.
So it goes back to your point earlier on, right? Where communication were taken, because she usually doesn't say that. So it was out of the norm. And because of my previous conversation, which just happened minutes earlier, it impacted me in that way. And then I turned around, I was like, what do you mean by that? Right. But now I need clarity. Now I need closure. right? She's like, oh no, you just sound like you're really, like when it comes to this stuff, like you really know, like you really trained in it. And I was like, I'm so sorry. Now because you feel a little bit of like shame, right? And I'm like, you know what? I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to come across. Her. She's like, no, no, you're not coming across anyway. So I say that to maybe point out that maybe it's not something that happened 5, 10 years ago. It could be something that literally happened a few minutes ago where your mind is so accustomed to communicating that way. Like, how would someone who has our experience, or maybe someone who's well connected with their emotions, what if the other person isn't that connected yet and we're trying to get them there? How do we communicate? How do we receive communication from that person without thinking that we're trying to maybe flaunt our expertise or soothe them or diagnose them?
That's fair. I think one of there is a coping skill that I learned, and I also put it in the book because I think it's such an important one, reflecting, right? And the science of reflecting is repeating back to you what you said and what I understood from what you said, and giving you the opportunity to tell me if I am correct in my understanding of what you said, right? And so when you express that, that's the first thing that came to my mind, which is if I'm trying to get somebody to maybe see my point of view, let me make sure that I'm seeing their point of view. I think people want to be heard. And sometimes when I want to be heard, I'm not necessarily listening. Uh, right? So the concept behind reflecting is to make sure that my grandpa used to say that all the time, like we have 2 ears and one mouth to listen twice as much as we speak. So in reflecting, I am actually listening to what you're telling me. It's funny because I had this experience with somebody where, again, we're talking politics, different points of view. But at that point, I was saying, okay, so I know you want to be heard. You want your points to be heard. So let me step into that position. And I would reflect back, this is what you said. This is what I heard. Is this correct? Yes. And then I went very imago on this, like, is there more? And then the person will say, right? Yeah. So after that individual was done talking, I said, okay, so now I'm going to tell you my argument. I'll ask that you please listen and repeat it back to me the same way that I did. And then I said what I was going to say. And I asked, could you please repeat it back? And when he repeated it back to me, he repeated back to me what he thought I was going to say, but not what I said. And the funny thing is that his wife was beside me and she looked and she's like, that's not what she said. But sometimes we are so sure that that is going to be the other person's argument that although we are listening, we're not hearing them. So I like the concept of reflecting because like it gives the other person the opportunity to say, no, that's not what I said. And maybe that's a place where we can understand what are the words that I'm saying that are getting lost in translation.
Is that something that you find to be a common struggle in the clients you work with?
The listening.
Well, listening to understand instead of listening to respond.
Yes, like sometimes like we are so focused on what we want to say or what we believe the other person will say that we are not actually listening. And that is something, that's when I work with couples, I would do joint sessions and individual sessions, and I often will determine whether or not we're ready for joint sessions by identifying, are you at a place where you're able to listen, or do you still want to talk? Right. So I like using the 3 columns of communication because I want the person to identify what's the message that you want to give. And then be able to acknowledge whether or not the other person was able to receive that message. One of the things that I'll say that my husband, I love my husband. That's a silly, well, not silly, but that's just a comment. But the reason that I said I love my husband is because I'm thinking of our communication. And sometimes like I can tell him something or he'll tell me something, and we get mad. And we usually will tell each other, like, I will respect what you said. I get to not like what you said. Right. So if I want you to go somewhere with me and you're telling me that you're going to go, but that moment you're like, you know what, I'm not feeling up to it, I'm not going to go. I'm like, seriously? and I get upset, I have the right to be upset, but I need to respect. Right. And so it's sometimes we don't give the other person the right to feel what they feel and what we're going to tell them because we don't want that frustration. But learning sometimes to, as we're listening, the more that we learn about each other, the better able we become to communicate and to listen to each other. The better we also become at allowing the other person to have emotions while still being okay. Does that make sense?
It does. And then it took me to a place where if we don't know the person we're with, actually let me rephrase that. I think that communication is one of the biggest pillars when it comes to any relationship that is healthy. I think a lot of unhealthy relationships lack communication, but they may not necessarily lack sex, right? That's what I believe. So when I see when I hear that you're saying that, it brings me to a place where if I don't know my partner and if I don't care to know my partner, or if I'm not equipped to know my partner, then communication I think is going to be difficult. Because really, what am I going to say, right? Or being open to even hear what they want to say. So I wonder what is preventing people from putting themselves in a situation to be heard and to be known.
I mean, it's a good question. Um, if I'm going to so many different areas right now in my mind. One of them is sometimes we find patterns in the people that we choose, right? Because it's what's familiar to us. I mean, we can go back to Bowen, like the father of marriage and family therapy. He talks about differentiation of self, and that we tend to look for the same people until we become kind of different. So if I often find myself in a relationship where I feel like me, that example, walking on eggshells, right? Without doing some searching and understanding who is the partner that I don't want to be and who is the partner that I do want to be, the likelihood that I would just continue repeating my pattern is high, because I will often feel attracted from the same people. And that's when you say, well, very Freudian of you, always go to your parents. And like, but it's who are the people that you first know? What's that the relationship that reminds you of? Never to like say that, the person in an abusive relationship is the one to blame, not at all what I'm saying, but we just tend to choose the same people without really understanding how come. So we need to kind of get to know ourselves a little bit. And sometimes we don't take the time to get to know ourselves. Because it's not something really that we learn. Hey, have you met yourself? Do you like who you are? Have you talked to yourself in the mirror? It's just the person that knows you best, right? People don't necessarily do that. So I think learning about who we are and what we want can really help us in identifying who are the people around us that foster that. Like for me, as I said, like I wanted to be a person who didn't walk around eggshells. I wanted to be, like something as very silly. I come from a family, or my mom mainly is a picky eater. She does not eat veggies. I found the world of vegetables when I went out to college, and oh my God, I love vegetables. I could so be a vegetarian without an issue. I just also like meat and fish and all that good stuff. But I have many things that I've been a picky eater at, very limited, right? One of the exercises, which is a bonus worksheet that I added here, is what I call me in 3D. And part one of the me in 3D is who I was, who I am, and who I want to become. I was a very picky eater. I am much better at being adventurous with my eating. I still want to get better at that. But usually people around me will always say, well, you don't like that. You don't eat that. Do you eat that? No, Patricia doesn't eat. And I always felt judged. And my husband helped me feel okay with not wanting to try something or wanting to try something. So he helped me be a better version of myself. Um, and today, like when I look at some, I had an oyster. That was the Everest for me. Okay. I had never had an oyster in my life. But it usually the thought would have been, oh, whereas the thought now is, okay, I don't know what you taste like. Let me try you. And if I don't like you, let me have something here that I like to go like right after. Right. But as we can essentially like change, and as we change, our choices of whom we want to have around us also change. I kind of went somewhere totally different to kind of go back there. I hope I
No, it's the devil you know versus the devil you don't know,
100%.
right?
Yeah.
And the devil that you know is less scary than the devil that you don't know. And that's why people get it's scary to even think of that. And I like for you, like you're looking, you deal with, is it men, women, both? Do you
Both.
work with both? Both. So for me, I work mostly with women over a certain age, over 50, like I've mentioned, and their needs are a lot different because a lot of them have been there and done that, and they're just trying to ride off into the sunset, into the twilight of their life, right? Versus you have both, and when you're dealing with both men and women, do you find common struggles that they go through when they're trying to understand all of this?
So I have not done a study on this. So I'm not speaking statistically. I am speaking from my empirical experience. I always find that really important to say because there's a difference between data and opinion, right? One of the things that I've noticed in well, I've worked both with same-sex marriage and heterosexual marriages. So I'll speak on different genders, husband and wife, just making it one of the things that I've noticed a lot: silence. Men will often use silence as a I don't know what to say, I don't want matters to get worse. Women will interpret that silence as you don't care, which would then make them speak louder and more forcefully in wanting to get a reaction, which makes the male even more silent. Right. So that's one of the avenues or one of the things that I noticed, right? Silence speaks volumes. So you want to make sure that it is saying what you want it to say. Right? Allow people to know the meaning behind your silence. Um, so yeah, that's one example that I can give that I've noticed being a pattern. I can actually give a second one, which is, and this came even from a personal experience of mine with a really good friend, but something that I noticed, like for the guys, is um, if this is an insipid thing. So I like, why should I mention it if it means nothing? Like, let's say like an ex messaged you and you deleted it, and so you're like, this, please no, like I didn't communicate, there was no interaction, this means nothing, so why am I going to bring it up to make it a mess, right? Whereas the female point of view, again, empirical, not database, but my experience has been, if you have nothing to hide, why are you hiding? Ergo, if you're hiding, is because you have something to hide. Especially, so the finding of information becomes really pertinent to one person, whereas to the other was like, but it was insipid information, but I found this. And that becomes a big problem.
The first one, I've done that where there was something happened. I don't remember, but I was silent. It was over the phone, and I was silent, and then she started talking more. You know what ended up happening, Patricia? I did a whole load of laundry while she was talking. I didn't even say a word. And I looked at my phone. I was like, did that actually just happen? Like in hindsight, you feel kind of ridiculous, right? That you're so silent and this person just kept talking and talking to get you out of it, right? To your point, the more you're quiet, the more they talk and the louder it gets. I was like, you know what? I don't have time to deal with this. I did my laundry, I washed it, put it in the dryer. I just kept her on speakerphone as she was just going on and on.
Wow.
And right, it was just crazy. And the second one, the person who I mentioned, who I spoke to, who I spoke about earlier, that sorry, one of my friends, that happened to her where this was like years ago. And she went to, sorry, my male friends, he went to go give, the phone was ringing and he went to go give the phone to his wife, but it was unlocked. And you know, a lot of times, like regardless if you have it locked or not, when it rings, it shows you like the number or the name of the person. He turned to her because the phone was upside down, which I think is like a pet peeve for everyone. Like when you place it screen down, so everyone's like, what are you hiding? Why
What?
can't I see the screen?"
Ah,
So he gives her the phone, but he gives it and he rotates it so the screen's facing up. It was a man calling, and it was a picture of the man and his wife, which is his wife. So the husband now is giving his wife the phone, and the man calling has a picture of the two of them together on the phone, right? So after he's done the conversation, he has it, and he's like, "Oh, you know, that was just a vacation. That was just a picture we went on vacation with." But in his mind now, because he sees it, like your point, right? Or what are you hiding? Now he's asking the questions, right? And it turns out that it was a lot bigger. But I think to your point, sometimes the information finds us.
yeah.
And I think sometimes people go searching for like how many like you deal with couples. Have you ever heard of them? They would like stalk their social media with like a burner account to see what they're commenting on or what they're liking. Like I've heard of that. Have you heard of that?
I had a couple because like there was infidelity. This was years ago that there was this app apparently that the husband's phone was cloned for the wife to be able to like see everything. Uh, but he was aware that she had it, and then we had talked about, so it's interesting. It's actually come up recently the difference between um, hiding and privacy, right? We had that conversation. Like, is it okay to share passwords, right? Is it like my husband doesn't have the password to my stuff, and I don't have the password to his stuff, nor do we find the need to have it. Whereas there are couples that they find that need. Like, if I have felt that I needed it, I would. That's one of the things that I'll say. Most people don't explain the reason behind needing something, right? So if I had issues in the past that would lead me to want to have my husband's passwords, that it would be important for me to search how come, right? Would he be willing to share it with me temporarily while I work on this? And then how do we work on our trust enough that I know that I no longer need it? Because if not, it becomes an indefinite thing. And yes, there is lack of privacy, but then we need to talk about trust and the meaning of trust for each person. One of the things that I like to do with my clients is I ask them, what's the doctrine of their relationship? So I would explain that in my relationship, I say that the doctrine is partnership. Essentially, whomever is having like the worst day, the other one functions up. I know that I can always count on him and he can count on me, and it's partnership. I've had clients that after we talk about it, they're like, well, the doctrine of my relationship is honesty, right? Loyalty, trust. But those are beautiful words, but they can mean different things to different people. So now we need to define them, and not only define them, but say what are behaviors that signifies trust, and what are behaviors that don't signify trust. What are behaviors like when I said the other one functions up here? So what are behaviors that my husband has done that has allowed me to feel that I can count on him? Because that's part of trust. Now, I had talked to you about punctuality before. For a long time, part of like somebody being punctual meant whether or not I can rely on you, right? And me being able to rely on you, it's similar. It really, for me, went hand in hand with being able to trust you. Now, I'm from Sao Paulo. My husband is from Rio. We're both Brazilian. In his family growing up, being 30 minutes late, it's being on time. For me, and being 15 minutes early is being on time. So we had a really difficult experience. Like my siblings, whenever we had like dinner, they're like, "Oh my God, please tell your in-laws it's like at 5, so they will show up at 7, right?" Because like it was difficult for them at first. It was difficult for me at first. So I had to dissociate trust with punctuality and understand what are things that allows me to trust my husband, and knowing that I can count on him and on my in-laws when I need them, they show up. I'm like, okay, then trust means something different than I thought it did. And there are different behaviors associated to trust outside of punctuality. Um, I don't know why I went that direction, but I kind of did. But does that, again, my usual sentence, does it make sense?
Yes, because I've had a similar conversation, and trust to the person was being there when they need you, but in a lot of ways they wanted to be proactive because they're coming from a situation where the men that they dated weren't there for them emotionally, financially, or even in other ways in the relationship. So when they came across someone who would something as simple as carrying the groceries from the store, they had a hard time letting go of that, right? So I remember they painted the picture where she was carrying the grocery bags. You know, when it's so heavy, you start to lean to one side. That was her. And the other person's like, "What are you doing? Give me a bag," right? But because she couldn't let go of it, right? Because as you mentioned, like she was in a situation where when she wanted to trust someone to help her with the day-to-day activities, the previous people fell short. So now you have someone who can do more than that, but she's having difficulties understanding that. So I think that ties into what you're saying.
Yeah. So remember I told you about the yo-yo of my life, like 2009, and then the other long-term relationship I had, well, the somewhat long-term, but he was older. And one of the things that he told me, and I thought that was like, oh, that's how like we bring baggages with us without sometimes if we're noticing. A lot of the times with yo-yo, we would make plans, but they wouldn't come through. And so, you know, when you make plans with people, but you already expect that it's not going to happen, which is very defeating. And I really disliked it. So when I went into this new relationship, every time that we planned something, I would always somehow give an excuse or give him an out. And at one point, he turns to me, he's like, "Stop thinking I'm not going to show up." And I was like, oh my. Yeah, because to me, that was the normal. So my defense mechanism was to already create a scenario that gave you an out so I wouldn't be as hurt. But that was annoying to him because he's like, "Stop thinking that we're not going to do things." And that became one of the things of the partner that I want to be, somebody who is not expecting that things are not going to happen. Right. So one of the things, even with my husband, sometimes, you know, like you plan things and you need to cancel because of work and stuff like that. So when I notice that it happens like 1, 2, or 3, I will go to him and I'll let him know, hey, this is like getting somewhere. So when we make a plan, let's make sure we stick to it. Or if you can't, I'm still gonna go. I'm just gonna make my plans, and like I hope that you come with me. But I'm able to vocalize that to him because he understands the trigger that I have from past relationships when it comes to this specific thing. So talking about past relationships in our relationship is actually very important because we learn the things that we did like and we learn the things that we like.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like for me, like money has always been like a sensitive topic because I grew up without money. So when someone would like when I used to like proactively date and then it would always come up in the conversation, I didn't really like to tell people where I worked, how much I made because I'm corporate, I'm a manager in my job, things like that, right? So I came up with this joke that said that I make $45,500, which is in Canada, which is slightly higher than what the average black man makes.
Okay.
But slightly lower than what the average white man makes. So I'm right in that nice middle area, right? So I ran with that joke, and I remember one time, when I first started, it must have been like 5, 6 years later, and I said it to one of my friends who was aware of that. He's like, you would think that in 5 years you'd get at least a raise. Or like, aren't you making at least 47.5? Right. But then I was like, oh my God, I have been saying it
for
that
so long.
long,
Yeah.
right? And it's like to your point, right? Like something has been going on, and then because it's been going on for so long, you're like, wow, it's literally been that long, right?
Yeah, it's the concept of defense mechanisms. When I talk about it in the book, essentially I'll say like our triggers are their behaviors or things that have hurt us in some way that lead to defense mechanisms. And defense mechanism, there is an initial intention to it, which is to protect ourselves, right? But what ends up happening is that the defense mechanism stays even when the circumstance that warranted it to begin with no longer exists. And it's not until we become aware of it that we can say, hey, is it still serving that function? Is it actually helping me or is it harming me now? But it becomes the way, right? We go back all the way to the beginning of our conversation, like this is the way. Our defense mechanism just becomes the way. Again, sometimes we don't even remember where it comes from, but it's just how I do things. I just tell people 45,500. That's just how I do this. And because it was to me a practical decision for that very uncomfortable question, my defense mechanism. And until somebody brings it to your attention, you're like, oh, okay, maybe this is not the way.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. I was like, oh, so I look back now and it's been like what 10, 15 years, 10 years at least. And I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm still like now it's like a joke because I've
Yeah.
resolved it, right? But I remember why is it was just it's always been that way with me for so long, especially in my 20s, because I just didn't have it.
Yeah.
Right. So it was like it's like how some people like will just lie, right? They'll just create that they have this job, they have this car, they have this house. Like I remember I used to see some of my acquaintances, what they would do is that if they knew they're going on a date, let's say for example, like one of them going on a date with you, you're single, like they would rent out a car just so they could seem fancy, right? And then if you just say, hey, I'm instead of meeting up on Saturday night, how about Wednesday? They're like, oh no, 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 they can't because they didn't have the car to rent, right? So I guess eventually, if you're going to buy the car now, or eventually if you're to get a newer car, the defense mechanism would be like, okay, you know what? I've continued this lie. Let me go get that car that I've been lying with. So now it's not a lie, but you still feel the power of the lie.
Yeah, we create this facade of who we believe that we should be or who we think other people want us to be. And sometimes it's not that at all. Because maybe the person that you are going out on a date with is doing the exact same thing, right? Because they are thinking the exact same way. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like human dynamics. Like you're trying to impress people when really it's like when you go outside and you're like, okay, everyone's watching me. No one's actually really paying attention,
Yeah.
right? And I think people miss that. People who behave this way, maybe they think all eyes are on them. Like the people have their own issues. Like someone is working, coming home from working 12 hours. Someone has to go pick up their kids. Someone is trying to juggle. Okay, I have my kids at home. I'm trying to get dinner ready. What am I going to eat? Everyone has their own issues. So I think maybe one of the ways that we can get through what is impacting us is to just understand, as you pointed out, right? Like, what's the source of it? Why did I create this?
Yeah.
And is it still going to serve me? Like me saying I make 45.5, no one's gonna believe that because when they come over to my house, they're gonna be like, "You got this for 45.5?" I'm like, budgeting, you know. Then now you come up with a new lie to justify the old lie, right? Do you
Yeah.
see that as well? Like people get caught up in this web of lies and
Like,
they lose themselves in it.
you don't know how to get out of it. You don't know because we will end up creating like this sandcastle of lies because we think that if I tell the truth now, um, is gonna end the world. The world is gonna implode. Like this person is never gonna trust me again. So we just continue to build up on more and more lies. Um, and I think that if we were able to come clean as to the reason behind the first lie, it would just be a lot better on us. But it seems easier to go the other direction.
How deep have you seen someone go when it comes to just the rabbit hole of lies?
I mean,
Right. And
not
I'll tell you why I asked that. I asked that because I have a friend And I don't even think he remembers who he was before the lie anymore.
Okay. I mean, there's also the fake it till you become it, right? Which is those are different things. But I had there's this person that I knew that would he was dissatisfied with his life. So whenever he would meet somebody whom he liked, he would create the persona that he wanted to be. It wasn't even about how you would see him, it's about how he would see himself, and he got somebody to see him the way that he wanted to be seen. Um so that was like, again, it was at a satisfaction with one's own life. And sometimes, like, our comfort zone is not until we get so uncomfortable with our comfort zone that we decide to do something about it. That's usually when people come to therapy, right? When like it's hit the fan, and we're so comfortable that we need to do something about it. But like, you can get lost into that lie, but it can serve two purposes. One can be that I am so lost in it, that I don't know how to come clean because I'm still not doing anything to make that person that I want to become true. I just want to lie about it. Or I can take steps towards becoming that person. And that lie has actually helped me become that individual. So it depends on the route the person is going with it.
It's like the mask doesn't ever fall off. They just continue to add layers to it.
Yeah. Yeah. But I don't know, like, I feel like with my clients, at least with me, I want to believe, like, a lot of them will say, like, in sessions, like, this is the place that I get to just like do truth bombs. Confidentiality, right? Can't tell anybody. Like, oh,
Absolutely,
let's
absolutely
go
right.
reality again. uh
Yeah, it's like a safe place where they can be themselves. Because vulnerability, it's so tough for so many people.
it is, but vulnerable, that's the thing, like, some people say, well, vulnerability, if I when I'm vulnerable, the other person can use the things that they know as a weapon. And I'll say vulnerability is a gift. And I think that it can allow for intimacy to be created and connections to be created. So yeah, it can go both ways depending on the people you're surrounding yourself with, I guess. Um, but it's a gift.
I think so as well. Like I think it's a gift for both people. So to be able to be vulnerable to someone, I think that's a gift because it takes courage and to be that person that someone wants to be vulnerable with also is a gift because then you're that safe place because a lot of people struggle with
Yeah.
that, especially these days, like you mentioned, right? It could be used against you. Like how many times, like if you've seen social media, like how many times do people, and I don't recommend this, but people still do it, is that they'll go bare their soul on social media and someone will use it against them. And
Yeah.
it's a lot of times it's someone that they actually know.
Yeah. That's the thing, like, there's so many positives and negatives when we talk about internet and social media, but one of them is the facade, right? Like, I am do saying anything that I want to say from the comfort of my home. No one really needs to know. So it can be positive or negative. I've kind of seen like going both ways.
Yeah, and the support is so temporary, right? Because once they log off, that's it,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
And
Like
I
where do
think
you
that,
go?
sorry.
No, I was gonna say no. Where do you go after that? Once they log off, like where do you go?
Yeah, and I think depending on the generation that you were born into, the significance of social media is very impactful. Um, because it became part of our personality and how we see ourselves and how we're perceived. I mean, I am inept when it comes to, like, there's a expression in Portuguese, zero à esquerda, which is translates to zero to the left, which means nothing in English. But like, I am not an avid social media person. So if I don't, without trying to understand the importance it can have onto other people, and somebody's talking to me about social media, I might say, oh, that's silly, it's social media, who cares, right? So becoming aware of the importance that it can have in people's lives, depending on the impact or how much they use social media, it can actually be like, it may be the majority of my social network can be social media. So being unfriended by somebody though to me may not mean anything, to others it can mean a lot. I remember going back to ex-boyfriends, I would tell them I am going to unfriend you, not because I dislike you, is I don't want to see what's going on in your life, like all of a sudden just pop up on my social media, because it's hurtful, right? I don't want to all of a sudden see you with another girl because it's hurtful to me. In 2009, the year that I told you about, like part of not thinking was drowning myself in social media. That's when I was the most into like liking everything and do like because I didn't want to live my real life. So I lived the virtual life. Um, yeah.
I had someone that they fell into that where they went online and to your point, they were existing in that type of reality and then he started to like play a lot of video games and that became his reality and then he ended up actually liking people less and less to the point where he would actually say that I hate people.
Wow. Okay.
So like it was a big switch for him because he was pretty social and then something started happening and then he started to fall with a few friends, very few. But the fall was over serious things. So when he started to go online and live that reality, he became who he wanted to be virtually. And
Okay.
then unfortunately, what he started to do was he started to treat his friendships like online games. So I don't know if you ever played online games, right? So if someone says something you don't like, you can just either log off or just block them. So that's what he started doing in real life, right? He's like, oh, you say something I don't like? Okay, bye bye. No resolution, no conversation, nothing. And like just to see the transformation was kind of disheartening in a way, but it's to your point. Like if you're not living your life currently in reality, if you some people get lost in the online and then that becomes their reality.
That's one of the things that I love about the Me in 3D. So I've added, and I call them bonus worksheets because they were not part of the IAP, but I've developed, I did the Me in 3D and the We in 3D are the two last worksheets on my book. But I have, and I'll read for you the way that I have it done. Um, for the Me in 3D is who I was, who I am, and who I want to become. And I say the Me in 3D is an introspective activity aimed to help us define the destination of who we want to become in order to set the coordinates as to how we'll get there. I once you identify who I was, who I am, and who I want to become, being um, patterns of behaviors, attributes, or things about myself, I then ask you to identify what are things you want to maintain, amplify, or change. So it's what I call the MAC acronym. The things that I want to maintain, right, continue doing, amplify, do more of. The things that I want to change, I then break it down. And once we break it down, I'll ask you to figure out where is the easiest place to begin that change. I then, in part two, is how I see myself, how I believe others see me. I cannot know unless I ask, and how I would like to be seen. And then I would do again the maintain, amplify, and change. Oh, sorry, the maintain, amplify, and change goes into Win 3D. Then the last part that I have is for you to identify what is your self narrative, right? How do you talk to yourself about yourself? And then identify what is the way that you would like to talk to yourself about yourself. So I have you identify 3 positive affirmations. Because if I often tell myself that I suck, then I'm continuing to believe that I suck. But if I tell myself, okay, there are times when I suck, but I actually am doing pretty well. Like I have my job, I am self-sufficient, so I'm not that bad. I may not be able to say I am awesome, but I'm able to foster a better relationship to myself. But I need to pay attention as to how I'm talking to myself. Um, so yeah, I guess it was like my final thoughts of the concept of who we are and who we want to be.
Yeah, so as we close, touch on the maintain, amplify, and change and what connections that they have and how that could help us in our life going forward.
Okay, so what I really love about, I'll go back here. I wrote it, so I don't need to memorize it. Uh, so when I explain maintaining, amplify, and change, and this is on the, I'll go to the mean 3D instead of the win 3D. Maintain, I put things about me that I like, that I am doing right, and then that I would like to keep on doing. Right? We often criticize ourselves. So depending on the culture you came from, I can tell you about my culture growing up. My grandpa would always like, he would say that his job was to put food on the table for us, and right, like, and our job was to do well in school. So if you got an A, you are not doing more than what you're supposed to be doing. But if you got anything below like a certain grade, oh my God, it was hell and water. So one of the things that I learned, and I cannot generalize to everybody, but I can tell me personally that I learned was not to um, congratulate myself for my accomplishments, but to really chastise myself for my failures. And knowing this, I became very much aware that criticism was, I used to take criticism much more than compliments. I actually saw that being proud and talking about myself meant bragging, and bragging was a negative thing because you're supposed to be humble. So it was a really difficult thing to be proud of the things that I did. And so I constructed what I call instructive compliments. That's also part of the book. And there are purposes to compliments, right? It's not supposed to be fluff. Just like constructive criticism, you talk about the things that you didn't do well and how to improve it. Instructive compliments are focusing on what are the things that you're doing well so you can keep on doing them, right? So it's focusing on both, and that was part of the maintaining. Amplifying is what are things about me or in my life that I would like to do more of, that I'm already doing, but I think doing more of would benefit me. Change, think of things about me or in my life that I would like to change. Be very specific, break this attribute or pattern of behavior to its smallest pieces. This way you can select the easiest piece to start implementing a change today. And so I'll put the example that I had here that came from a client. This client of mine said, I want to, because of like a relationship or whatever, part of the person that she was very bubbly and artistic and creative. And after that relationship, she noticed like, I am not a creative person. She's like, I want to bring creativity back. And so I'm like, creativity is a big name. Break it down. What do you mean? Like painting, dancing, singing, like, what do you mean by that? She's like, writing. I was like, okay. So writing, what type of writing? Like writing on paper, like writing on the computer, like typing. She's like, writing on paper. I was like, where? Indoors, outdoors, like writing outdoors. Like, okay, in a cute little journal or just like random sheets of paper. So like a cute little journal. It's like, okay. So your first step after session is to go buy a cute little journal and a nice pen. That's all you need to do to start implementing that change, right? The smallest piece that I can find. By the next session, she had written a couple pages of poetry because she went, got the pieces of paper, the cute journal, the pen, went to the beach and wrote, right? But all we needed was an easy step as opposed to think about the wholesome of it, being creative again, that, oh my God, that is so big, it's overwhelming that like, I don't know how to start.